On this channel, I've planned from the beginning to have discussions about many works of philosophy and how they can be used to fuel science fiction and fantasy writing. And I knew that from the beginning, this book, today's book, was one that I wanted to talk about. And the book in question is Albert Camus' The Rebel. And this was a work of philosophy that Albert Camus wrote sometime after World War II, which dealt with the problem of using violence to solve the problem of oppression. It's the problem of justifying our beliefs in violence, of developing arguments for them, and whether or not that is even possible. And the way he talked about this in the book's introduction was whether it was possible to create what he called logical crime, of making murder permissible. And he wrote all of this, as you can imagine, in the wake of everything that had happened in World War II, but he was also using it as a way to look back over the previous 200 years of history, with all of its many revolutions and uprisings and transformations of government. And to that end, it is an essay rather than a formal history of revolution and revolt. So it's a little bit more free associative. He organizes it along philosophical lines rather than along any particular historical trends or anything like that. It's more free associative than a history. But for that reason, it's also that much richer and that much more thought-provoking than just a simple historical rundown of trends of rebel violence over the years would have been. And the way he starts off is by asking the simple question, what is a rebel? And he answers this by saying a rebel is a man who says both no and yes. He says no to his own oppression, and he says yes to the possibility of a better future. And that better future will be achieved by overthrowing whatever it is that is oppressing him. But he also points out that every rebellion has within it the seeds of its own destruction. Every French Revolution has the seeds of its own terror. And that history has shown, much to our dismay, that some things in life cannot be resisted any other way except through violence. And that violence can also take multiple forms. He doesn't just talk about political rebellion or political violence here. He also talks about cultural and spiritual violence and rebellion. So the book also works as a kind of a grand tour of the different flavors of rebellion, what people in the past have risen up against, what it cost them to do so, and what they left behind for others to clean up. So one of the earliest chapters, for instance, when he talks about the Marquis de Sade and how that was also part of, to some degree, the French Revolution that was playing out around him at the time. But he also looks at the Russian terror against the Tsars during the 19th century, before the Communist Revolution, the Nihilists, as they were called, and who were depicted so memorably in Dostoevsky's book Demons. Camus was so impressed by this story, by the way, that he wrote his own stage play adaptation of the book. And he felt a great sympathy for the people who were rebelling what at the time were terrible conditions, but at the same time he understood that the manner in which they executed everything and the way that they wanted to absolve themselves of the responsibility for all of their actions was also, in its own way, at least as bad. So I mentioned earlier that that Camus talks about rebellion taking multiple forms. And one of the forms that he talks about is art itself as a form of rebellion. That when we create a work of art, we are in essence resisting the conditions of the reality that exists around us. We invent our own set of conditions. We are modifying existing reality a little bit by bringing our creative work into it. Whenever we create something new, we end up living in a very different world because of it. The kinds of thinking and feeling and vision that gets inspired by great works of art, they can make changes that are just as deep and profound as anything political. Think about how your favorite movie or your favorite book changed things for you forever when you discovered it, especially if it was a piece of fantasy or science fiction, and how it may have also changed the rest of the world in some way. There's definitely a case to be made for a culture before and after something like Star Wars. But again, rebellion always comes at a cost. And sometimes that cost is a world that is not necessarily an improvement, where there may have been a trade-off. And this is about more than just revolutions that turn into tyrannies. It's also about the realization that once the spirit of revolt is in the air in one form or another, it doesn't go away by itself. Once it's touched off, it's almost impossible to snuff out. And aesthetic rebellions have traps of their own. This is something de Sade discovered for himself the hard way, that if you have an aesthetic rebellion that you intend to pursue all the way to the bitterest end, there is no turning back. So what does Camus propose as an answer to this problem that rebellion contains within the scenes of its own demise? And his answer is rooted in his philosophy of the absurd, and I would honestly need to make a separate discussion of that in detail to really do it justice. But the short version is that the philosophy of the absurd asserts that life has no inherent meaning, but as long as we keep confronting that fact and defying it continuously, day by day, sometimes even hour by hour, life becomes worthwhile by way of the process of confronting this meaninglessness. We will never be fully free. There is no way to ever be fully free, just as there is no way to ever be fully safe. But that does not mean that we always have to live as slaves. There will always be this tension. No matter what our conditions, no matter how good they can become, there's always something that we feel we're going to want to resist or rebel against. And even if we do it correctly, he says, there is always still going to be injustice. But again, that doesn't make rebellion useless. It just means that we have to recognize there's no way to bring all of our sufferings to an end without having at least some kind of encounter with tyranny or nihilism or everything that we would presumably not want as part of our liberation. We can diminish the suffering of the world in the moment we live in, but we're never going to remove it entirely. And as long as we rebel with this in mind, as long as our rebellions are informed by this kind of wisdom, and as long as we have that as a principle, we can fight for better things. And it may be that we don't have a choice but to do that. As Camus himself says, art and rebellion will die only with the last man on earth. And that reminds me of another line that I heard somewhere, which is, we are as gods, we might as well get good at it. Now, to tie all of this into the creation of science fiction and fantasy, there are some aspects of it that came freely to me as I was rereading the book and taking notes. And one of them is the use of resistance, of rebellion, as a common story theme in science fiction and fantasy. I mean, I mentioned earlier, one of the most popular fantastic franchises of all time has at its very core the idea of a rebellion against an evil empire. On the other hand, that particular franchise does not really go into philosophical details about resistance and rebellion. Okay, there are aspects of shows like Andor, for instance, or Rogue One that do touch on this a little bit more deeply than the mainline Star Wars stuff does. But the general idea is that what rebellion is going to cost us, again, every society that revolts has to remember what comes next, or it's going to be doomed to repeat it. And I also thought about how oppression and rebellion manifest in different modes, depending on the mode of your story, depending on whether it's a fantasy mode or a science fiction mode, which roughly correspond to the past up to the present and the present up to the future. They have different dimensions. They have different forms. A rebellion staged in Middle-earth, for instance, would look and play out very differently from the rebellion staged in the world of Blade Runner, where the replicants, for instance, are rising up and demanding their freedom. They might be animated by some of the same raw impulses, the freedom from oppression, the freedom to live one's life in a self-determined way, but they're not going to get it the same ways. They're not going to think about it the same ways because the world around them has very different philosophical views about resistance. And they're not going to have their crusade regarded the same ways by the rest of that world. So with science fiction and fantasy, you have roughly a modern to postmodern worldview. And with fantasy, you have a roughly pre-modern to modern worldview. And there are going to be different political and social expectations about resistance and according to which of these modes you're taking. You may be, if you're only taking them in pieces, you're still going to be taking something from them. So in a modern setting, there's more of a sense that resistance can be justified. In a pre-modern setting, there's much more of a horror of it. It's much more abhorred, in big part because of the unquestioned assumption that you don't bite the hands that feed you, no matter what they are. Life in a pre-modern setting tends to be more precarious. Getting people to come with you to rebel requires them to take enormous risk, certainly greater material risks than could be made in today's world or tomorrow's world. So what kinds of people who agree to revolt in cases like that, what they want, what they're motivated by, what they can't get, what they're willing to risk, and not just physically, all of those things are worth thinking about. And all of those are going to be informed by the decisions that you've made about what kind of world you have and what kind of worldview it has, whether pre-modern, modern, or postmodern. So again, it's useful to think about how the worldview around rebellion is going to shape the use of it in your story. So maybe there could be a little too much enthusiasm around rebellion in your story, for instance, not just disdain. There might be, for instance, people who are cheerleading it for all the wrong reasons. And that could be because they have learned the lessons of that world's own history very poorly. So I also thought about the use of rebellion as a story element generally. Around this is the idea that every one of us, every single person that exists, has at least one completely justified grievance. And that even that just that one grievance can be fuel for a huge crusade. Science fiction and fantasy stories can get a lot of really useful input from this insight. Your bad guy always thinks he's a protagonist or a hero in his own mind. He's fighting for something. Maybe the only thing that makes him a bad guy in your setting is that he's not willing to recognize the kinds of things Camus laid out about rebellion, about its costs. Maybe he thinks no cost need be paid, or that the cost only be paid forever by others, never by him, or that he has some plan to pay that cost which requires sacrifice of some kind, particularly moral sacrifices, which he is more willing to make by way of others than others are willing to make for themselves. And again, finally, we don't have to talk about rebellion in a setting, especially a science fiction or fantasy setting, exclusively in the political or, sociological sense. We can talk about it in terms of aesthetics. Camus went on at length about this. So maybe you have someone who is an artist endeavoring to break some rules about what is considered acceptable or aesthetically correct in their world. And that might not just cost them popularity or the support of their patrons. It might also mean they end up with work that has aesthetic trade-offs they didn't anticipate. They came on stage expecting everybody to burst into applause, and instead they broke out laughing. That's a quote from Yukio Mishima. So it could be anything. It could be a spellcaster whose art is their magic. It could be a cyberpunk character who makes his art from the recorded or synthesized sensory impressions of themselves or others. And they want to go beyond existing limits. They want to transcend. They want to set themselves or others free. But what does that freedom really look like for them? What will it cost? And what will it cost not just them but others? And what will it actually make possible? What liberation would you really get from that? So whether your inclinations are to use this material for science fiction and fantasy storytelling, or whether you're just interested in the philosophical aspects, Camus' The Rebel comes recommended without reservation. It's available both in digital and conventional versions. I bought the UK Penguin edition, which has this very nice cover art. I like the UK Penguin editions. They're just so much more beautifully designed than the US counterparts. I don't know why the US versions are just so bland looking. They have the same text anyway. And also, one more thing. This is a book that really demands that you come back to it at different phases in your life, especially if you have different phases in your creative career and you've been drawing on it creatively as I did. Because as your experience grows, your appreciation for Camus' ideas are also going to evolve, enrichen, and gain additional depth. And that is a hallmark for a great piece of work. It's something that you can revisit at different phases in your life, and you're going to get something new out of every single time. And I hope if you read this, you agree with me. See what you think, and I'll see you real soon.